Okay, and I am going to go live on Facebook right now to our group. So it's a closed and private group for security, but we'll make the recording available on YouTube for later viewing. And we can start with a round of introductions.
So should I go first?
Hold on 1 second.
Oh, okay.
Let's make sure we're live. Okay.
Yeah, I guess there are multiple platforms going on right now. So.
Yes, and I'm trying to make sure. Okay, I think we are here. Let's see.
Was I muted that whole time, or do you want me muted?
Yeah, you were.
I was like saying hi to Hareem. Like, I don't know if they can hear me.
No, now I can though. Yeah, nice to meet you. So folks don't join this Zoom call. They're watching.
No, for our privacy, yes, it'll be just the three of us talking, and they will I will be monitoring the Facebook page if there's questions from folks viewing live, and they'll see the YouTube after as well. Okay, I think we are now live. Okay, why don't I go ahead and open it up? Let me make sure I have the keynote. Thank you so much, Hareem, for joining us. We are hosting our very second discussion for the Salon for Social Justice, and we will absolutely introduce ourselves to you. It's wonderful to have you here and to meet you, but I wanted to give you the floor to introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm really excited about this. It's always nice to have, space to talk through rather than, present and have a Q&A. I much prefer a dialogue. So this is exciting. My name is Hareem Khan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an assistant professor in cultural anthropology and ethnic studies at Cal State University in San Bernardino. And my bio is there, and basically it shows the journey of my research projects, and sort of beginning with this question around color and colorism that filled up most of my MA work. The first few years of graduate school that's what my focus was. And then subsequently I experienced some research visa complications, which didn't allow me to go carry out my actual dissertation research. So I had to switch gears and switch projects. And so what I ended up studying was still looking at consumption, but looking at it through the lens of race and labor, and how migrant women from South Asia are racialized in particular ways in the beauty industry. So for example, with skills like threading or henna, what kinds of meanings around, Orientalist meanings around authenticity, South Asia, and race get projected and lived by women who work in the service sector. But colorism has been, a part of just the ways that my own consciousness has developed over the years, way prior to graduate school, right? And it kind of filtered into an academic inquiry for me in around 2011. So it's been a while since I've, gone back into that work, but I think 2020 has brought a lot to the surface in terms of thinking about, what is the significance of having these kinds of conversation in light of the events of 2020, right? And so that's why I'm here, and I'm excited to have a chat with you, Tyler and Jordan.
Thank you so much. So I think, the folks that are within the salon are familiar with us, both Jordan and myself. We are just everyday folks gathering together to try to bring other folks together after the election to talk about issues of misogyny and race. And with the COVID crisis, I mean, the the group has gone into flux with life changes, etc. But with COVID, we definitely thought the discussions could happen online. And so here we are. We, cold email and cold call random folks to say, we want to talk about this as we try to grow and learn. That learning from experts have been really enlightening, and we've had great discussions with the community members themselves and our lived experience. But having that layer of expertise has been really eye-opening for us. And it seems to be a year of change and learning, so we really appreciate it. And I do tech by day, so I'm a marketing professional, and so this is, I get to play hooky and do this. And so it's been a real pleasure for me and my growth as an ally and as a woman of color.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. I am a social organizer with an arts and nonprofit background, and helped organize the Women's March in Seattle, and then met Tyler a few years ago, and we started the group when we were connected by a mutual friend who is an artist and organizer in Portland. And so all of that was by chance. It happened over Instagram, and then we were connected in Facebook. But it was really fortuitous because the group has been, enriching for both of us. And we're really glad to have the members in the group and be able to talk about these issues, especially as they do come to the surface again in 2020. So we're really glad to have you here and talk about this.
And as I was preparing for this piece of work really resonated with me, that race and color are two very different things. And within each race, the idea of your skin color, whether lighter or darker, is stigmatized or celebrated depending on the perspective of the person. And they're kind of like the main cultural force. And I think this picture really encapsulates how one color, many races, right? And yet we create these lines across what we think are ethnicities or different, phenotypes, etc. That doesn't necessarily make biological sense, but it has such cultural impact. And as we're doing that research, this resonated with me so much, was that we actually mapped the human genome, a while back. And yeah. And one of the clear things that came out of it is that there is no biological, genetic, or scientific basis for race, and yet this is something that we cannot seem to get rid of. And so with that said, I wanted to just kind of stop sharing my screen here because I think the dialogue is more important with us. So from your professional and academic opinion, I'm curious if you could define what colorism is for those watching right now.
Absolutely. I'll set up I'll first start off with a definition that I think is very commonly used, and especially this year where I've seen and I've observed a bunch of social media campaigns around colorism, right? Addressing and kind of taking this larger moment, following the killing of George Floyd and thinking about race critically. Folks in communities of color are trying to work through, okay, what does anti-Blackness look like? How is that related to colorism? And the definitions, however, that I'm seeing of the ways colorism is defined is largely, broadly speaking, as prejudice or discrimination against those with darker skin. And it's often, in many cases, perpetuated by folks within the same ethnic group, and can get as intimate as your family members and siblings, right, can harbor those feelings. But to me, if the definition stops there, I think we lose a lot from how colorism actually operates, right? Like if it becomes a sort of conversation around prejudice and discrimination that is not linked to the systemic nature of color.
Is Hareem frozen for you? You can
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's
Okay,
mine.
no,
That's
you're fine. Okay. Yes.
yeah.
You're saying that if it's not tied to the systemic scourge of racism, then
Right. It's actually, it does a disservice. And I think the disservice that's done is that we are unable to uh, pinpoint how the logics of it, how does it actually work, right? What gives it meaning, what allows it to flourish. And I think for me, when I talk about colorism, either with students or just with friends, it's like systems have to be a part of the analysis because colorism, like racism, is systemic, right? And so I remember there was this one, it was in 2013, I was living in Santa Barbara as a grad student who hated Santa Barbara and was just trying to find my way out. But there was like a Santa Barbara film festival or something that was going on. And there was a documentary that was being screened for that festival. And I was so excited because I think it was called Hue or something. And it was a showcasing of colorism across the world. It was a global lens onto the ways colorism takes place in South Asia and the Philippines and Canada. And the filmmaker is a South Asian man, and he brought in his own experiences of colorism. So naturally, I was really excited. That was my work at the time. So I went to the screening, and it's Santa Barbara. And the screening, it's mostly white folks in the audience, right? In Santa Barbara. So I was there, and I'm watching this film, and it turned out to be basically an expose of very isolated, sensationalized stories, right? So you had the situation in India where this woman could not find a partner. You had another situation, I think it took place in Jamaica. The point being was that all of these stories became sort of sensationalized through the lens of the director, such that there wasn't a way to actually connect these really powerful experiences to the reasons why colorism persists, right? So there wasn't an engagement with India being a site where there is caste oppression, colonialism, right? And no engagement with larger histories of enslavement, neoliberalism, right? So for me, it's like to understand colorism, you have to understand it as interlocked with all other systems of oppression. And so when this documentary kind of, cherry picked these stories, what the message they sent across was that how do we fix colorism? We fix our mindsets, right? We fix how we think about ourselves because it's an internal problem. And that is, I argue, is actually a racist argument, right? Because it puts the onus on people of color to do that work. And also, like in the case of South Asia, this isn't just something that's inherent in cultures, right? This is socially and culturally and politically constructed and then validated through systems. So for me, I love to see those definitions of colorism because I'm seeing, so much conversation around it. But for me, I always am trying to take it a bit further. Like, what is, how is, we talk about institutionalized racism. What is institutionalized colorism, right? And how do those speak to each other? So
absolutely. And I would love to probably come back to this to have you put in a nice little capping to that definition of the additional sentences that you would add to it. I in the research that we were doing around this as we were preparing was there is statistical significant research on whether or not you get promoted at work, the kind of sentences that you receive if you are to be convicted of a crime, and it's so much of it ties to those systems that you talk about. But I want to go back to what you said earlier around examples coming from India and Jamaica. It's why, I mean, literally every culture, and all three of us come from different cultures. In our culture, proximity to whiteness is seen as superior. And I think our assumption was that it's absolutely tied to colonialism. I'm wondering if you have more insight into that aspect of it.
yeah, there's a few, I can speak to the South Asian context. I did some of my work in India. And so this is going to be a little Indo-centric but I'm also, my mom is from Pakistan. And so I visited there and collected my own non-academic observations of what's happening. And when I talk to people and when I, was doing my readings, there are, colonialism often becomes one way to understand how white supremacy had a global reach, right? And so in the case of South Asia, you have colonialism, but colonialism, British colonizers were already taking a mapping of the social hierarchies that already existed, right? And so in the case of India, you have other social hierarchies that have been present for thousands of years. And so, caste is one of those hierarchies. And then also how caste and class shape the kinds of professions people are doing, their other religious and ethnic affiliations, their regional affiliations. These all play a role in how resources, how privileges are distributed among groups of people. And so in the case of South Asia, it's multiple things. It's absolutely, colonialism did play a significant role in further uplifting that sort of ideology of white supremacy that was building off of the caste oppression that was already existent. In addition, we can't lose sight of capitalism as well, right? As another factor that allows for the circulation of not just commodities and products, but also the ways that ideas around colorism travel. And so there are multiple, histories of colorism are complicated and they vary region to region. And so, for example, speaking about colorism in Black communities in the US would have to acknowledge histories of enslavement, right? And so basically what I'm saying is that the historical context and the political and economic context all kind of meld to give us a very complicated origin story, which is all around messy, but it's not just one trajectory, right? It's like there's different ways in which different forces rather that have brought colorism into existence as it is today.
So it became widespread through colonialism, and once it landed at a place, it kind of morphed into its own thing depending on how the history of that particular culture evolved. That makes perfect sense. Jordan, did you have a question you want to chime in with?
Yeah, I know that Hareem, you mentioned how, the system or the dynamics of colorism became entangled with histories of enslavement in different communities of color. I'm wondering if you can speak to, how that works in practice between communities where some people might have, lighter skin and then darker skin tones, whether it is South Asian communities or African American. And what that really means for our communities today.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And, we to talk about I'll start with South Asia, but to talk about the ways that histories of colorism have almost gained a new kind of force in the present day in the ways that communities of color build relations within and throughout, right? And so for me, when I think about the important, I think this ties to one of the questions, Tyler, you sent me, which was why is colorism important now, right? And so for me, it's, I think color and race are inextricably linked, right? So in the case of India, understanding discrimination and inequalities through the lens of color can actually transcend certain Western notions of race, which is usually along a white-black binary, right? So by allowing for a global perspective on race can actually speak to the ways, for example, ideologies around colorism and caste travel beyond South Asia, right? As folks migrate, they carry these ideas with them. And it's not a stretch for me to say that by coming, you know, if you're migrating to the US, some of those feelings around colorism can actually ignite and further, you know, allow for a kind of anti-Blackness within our communities too, right? Like, you know, colorism and anti-Blackness go hand in hand. And especially for, you know, like, for example, when you think of the migration of Asian migrants to the US and being sort of put against this model minority myth, which is actually rooted in anti-Blackness itself, right? And kind of seeing the ways that communities of color are being pit against one another through these kinds of logics. And I think colorism, what I'm hearing like this year, especially in the ways that folks are talking about color and trying to make that connection to anti-Blackness, you know, my question is always, what is, like what Jordan was saying, like, what does this actually look like in practice, right? What does it look like to have these kinds of conversations that make those connections between colorism as it's experienced for Black communities and colorism as it's experienced for South Asian folks, right? So I think there are definitely really powerful connections between these experiences. But it also, the overarching ideology that folks have to engage with is white supremacy. And so in order to understand how colorism thrives, particularly in the US, you know, a settler colonial state, is to really deal with how white supremacy has shaped the color, like the ways people experience colorism in the US more broadly. So, you know, I think that for, you know, thinking about this question, it also becomes a kind of reconciliation question, because following the killing of George Floyd, Nina Pop, Breonna Taylor, you had this sort of resurgence of, not even resurgence, like folks who were not part of these conversations before joining in and wanting to critically think through what was going on. And a lot of South Asian folks were doing that too, by supporting Black Lives Matter or, you know, starting these conversations about colorism. And I think the question that was interesting for me is, you know, how can we use colorism not just to talk about beauty standards, because often that's where things stop, right? But how can we use colorism to understand how anti-Blackness is transnational, right? It's not just here in the US, right? And also the second part of that is how caste and color shape anti-Blackness in the diaspora, right? And to reinforce the racial hierarchy that Black and brown people are subjugated in. And so that's the question I'm interested in, is sort of how, you know, what does that reconciliation look like? Can folks, South Asian folks, uphold and uplift Black Lives Matter at the same time there is a sort of negligence of the ways colorism is rooted in caste oppression as well as class oppression? So those are questions that I think are tough, but I am really hopeful, and I've been listening to some really amazing activists and organizers who are spearheading that work.
Awesome, and thank you for sharing all of that. That was amazing. And you got me thinking about, you know, how some of those dynamics play out, like within my family or peer groups as well. When you said that colorism isn't just, you know, interracial, but intraracial, and within groups that are perceived to be the same race. You know, I was just thinking how it is really prevalent within the Black community, how there's that internalized oppression and bias that's perpetuated, you know, because it's been rooted within the community for so long. I, you know, personally have family members who are more fair than I am, or my mom and my sister. My mom is in the group with us. And yeah, you know, I have at different points in my life just perceived kind of non-Black people approaching us differently, not knowing that we're related, or maybe not knowing right away. And I think it's really interesting. And yeah, that just goes beyond appearance or beauty standards, but the way that people communicate with us. And so yeah, I do see that as being a factor. And one of the other questions that I think we're kind of leading into is how the colorism and gender intersect.
Yeah. And to your thanks for sharing that. And for me, I was thinking as I was preparing for this talk, I was going to just weave in a bunch of personal experiences, because I think what is really insidious about colorism is that it's hard to describe to folks who don't know what colorism is or haven't experienced it, that sometimes it's just a gaze, right? It's just a look. It's just a sort of, position where there may not explicitly be saying something about your skin color directly, but there is a certain way in which that that feeling that folks feel when they are encountering somebody who's scanning them over, basically, right? And then clearly categorizing them. That's the mechanism of colorism. It is insidious. It doesn't have a neat sort of way of operating. And so sometimes it makes it really hard for folks to understand that it's not just a preference, right? That it's not just, I've had conversations with men who've said, well, is this any different from me wanting to date someone who has long hair versus short hair, right? And it is sort of couched in this kind of preferential, and I think that's because otherwise would require a lot more work for people to do, and folks are not willing to do that work. But the question around gender and colorism is also a really important one. And actually, I took a few notes because I wanted to make sure I touched on these things. And in the context of South Asia, and the proliferation of the skin lightening industry that is booming, right? It's not like it's not growing still. You have in those ads, you have this very blatant link between lighter skin and marriageability, for example, right? And so we saw this most recently. I don't know if either of you watched the series Indian Matchmaking. And so
I see it on my Netflix queue.
Yeah,
I do too.
I get to see it.
You haven't seen it? Okay. It's not worth it. But I mean, if you want to watch it, check it out. I watched it, my friend and I, we were like, we will watch it for the analysis, but in that, it's basically this South Asian woman in Bombay in India who is matching up, a lot of mostly, I would say, elite light-skinned Indians with partners. She's a matchmaker. And there, you notice the number of times when the participants or the people who were looking for partners would voice their preferences. And often it was located to skin color, like someone who's fair. And especially if mothers were involved in this conversation, they were, repetitively saying that they wanted their son or daughter to marry someone fair. And so, this is not something that has gone away, as much as I think people in the diaspora sometimes think that this is something that happens over there. It doesn't happen here. But again, this travels. And so the question of gender, heteropatriarchy is what gives light skin its value, right? And so if we are trying to dismantle colorism, that means heteropatriarchy has to come down too. Because even though, for example, with lightness, it's not just located to the experiences of women, right? It's also for non-binary folks, men who use these creams, and there is, but the ways that women's value are objectified in the institution of marriage is, I think, what makes a gender analysis absolutely crucial. And, you know, I'm not an expert. I just love thinking about this stuff all the time. But for me, and some of the earlier work I was doing, which was on cosmetic ads, while there were ads directed at men who were consumers, most of the ads by far were directed at women. And it wasn't just about wanting to become beautiful, which is where it gets interesting, because it was, yes, of course, the obvious is you'll get more beautiful, but there are all these other perks, right? You are going to be socioeconomically mobile. You are going to be modern, right? You're going to be a modern citizen consumer. And so there are all these other, it's like a package deal, right? So that's why, you know, colorism as linked to beauty, which I think a lot of, you know, I shared my piece with Tyler, which is not a takedown of influencing culture at all. It's just my own observations of how.
I read the article as well, and we shared it in the Salon from Where Your Voice Next. So thank you for that.
Oh yeah, no, and I you know, I want to preface and say that it wasn't about taking anyone down, but it was just this observation I was making, that women, and South Asian women in particular, who are posting about colorism, often kind of locate it to the realm of beauty and representation. And while I find, you know, I find that conversation to be also powerful in its own way, I think the omissions are actually more powerful, right? And so when it comes to talking about beauty and talking about women's beauty in particular, and talking about women's representations in Bollywood, for example, is also limiting and doesn't get at the full scope of how women actually live colorism, which isn't just through their gender, it's through also class, it's through caste, it's through region, it's through, you know, religion. And so I think for me, I would say that heteropatriarchy has given value to an institution of marriage that thrives on platforms like Indian matchmaking. But I think if we are to critically analyze colorism, it would require a really deep engagement with how these systems work, and what it would take to take down patriarchy, because with that, colorism comes down too, right?
I think one of the key things that we were going to address was, like, speaking of the influencers, can social media really help bring that to an end? And I think, how would colorism end? And it comes to this very giant task of, you know, everybody's like F to patriarchy this year because of so much of that, so much that's happened in 2020. But I think it's one of those things where, wow, that is such a system that we are so deeply entrenched in. How do we, you know, at which leg do we hack at first? And I think that's a question that I'd love any sort of enlightenment on.
Yeah, I'm not an organizer, so I'm going to speak about how I have these conversations in my classrooms, because the students are often way more inspiring to me, who's can come in with a lot of like all the bad things that are happening, and then they're just like, okay, let's find a way out of this. And so when I talk to them, what's interesting about social media is that while there are, you know, what I sort of refer to as these sanitized platforms, like they exist and they have an immense followership. So it's not that they're just a bunch of influencers doing this thing. They also have some kind of currency, right? In addition, you know, you have amazing social media spaces that are rooted in radical thought and rooted in Black feminist thought that are really asking us to make those bigger connections between colorism and the rest of the ways the world works. And that to me is more interesting. So it's like, for example, there was this, you know, one of the skin lightening creams, Fair and Lovely, there was a lot of pushback to that cream, and they came out and they said, okay, we'll change the name to Glow and Lovely, right? And we'll will solve the problem. And so, of course, those same folks who were, you know, pushing against these companies were also saying that this isn't enough, right? And so, you know, the conversation that comes after that is really interesting. So there's, you know, work done by organizers who, you know, I pay a lot of attention to the work done by an organization called Equality Labs, where they basically give us an understanding of how caste operates globally. And for me, that's given me way more information on how to think about colorism than just these, you know, sort of petitions to see more dark-skinned people on TV or in movies. Because that to me, like I struggle with this because I think representation is really important. I think that South Asian influencers, for example, offer some of that representation and produce their own content, so there's agency. But I also question, you know, what are the limits of that when the conversation doesn't get past a certain point that is, we are all one, we are all beautiful, we have the same, you know, like that's sort of where it ends. And so you often see like representations of colorism as a full spectrum of people of different skin tones being celebrated. But to me, it's like we can't get there because there's a big thing in the way, and that's systemic violence that's happening and disproportionately targeting darker people. So social media, I think there are great spaces on social media that are doing amazing work. I think this year what has been interesting is my own observations, probably due to the Instagram algorithms that are just really putting a lot of this content on my page, whether I want it or not, have kind of put me in this analysis mode where I'm like, there are interesting patterns here, and where is this leading us? So I don't have a resolution at all. There are just more questions.
Yeah, I understand that. It seems like it's, you know, a lot of complex intersecting pieces. And so it's going to take looking at each of them to start to, you know, piece out a solution. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about how colorism can also, you know, involve other features besides skin, you know, possibly like hair or eye color, and, you know, how those features combine to, you know, play a part in that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess in terms of like how systems might be engaged to combat that, you know, I wonder if you have any comments on the Crown Act. I know it was passed in California last year in New York, and then just this year in Washington, so that in the workplace, it's illegal to discriminate based on natural hairstyles and those types of features.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, skin color, and I think, Jordan, your question that I saw in the email that I can't speak to from a biological perspective, but there is a book by an anthropologist, Nina Jablonski, and the book is Living Color, I think. And in that, she does spend time talking about skin color and, you know, what gives skin color. But then she also goes into the question you just posed, you know, what is it about skin color when it gets, you know, when it gets put alongside other features or embodied alongside other features, you know, what kinds of different meanings can those combinations provide and offer? And I think, you know, one example that comes to mind is it was a talk show. It was like a Good Morning Pakistan kind of talk show, and it was set in Karachi, I believe, and it was a panel that was basically trying to raise awareness about colorism in Pakistan. And so my mom's Pakistani, so she recorded it for me, and she's like, just come and we'll watch it together. So, you know, this was, I think, after my film festival debacle, so I didn't have high hopes. But anyway, I went and I watched this, and it was astonishing the ways that they set up this conversation. And I promise it connects to your question, Jordan, but they had a panel of 3 women. So they had basically they were
We'll give her a second to come back. Hareem. We definitely want to hear how she's going to answer your question.
Yeah, I know that was a cliffhanger.
Oh, technology. Oh, there she is. Okay. That was a cliffhanger. So we
I've had
lost
meetings
you
all week, and this is the first time that this is happening. So I'm
No,
so
it's totally fine. It's the post-COVID Zoom world, you know.
I know. I know.
So you were just setting up how the panel was
Yeah.
constructed.
Right. And so the third panelist they had was a darker woman. She was also someone who everyone else was speaking in English. She wasn't speaking in English, couldn't speak in English. She also was wearing clothes that were clearly not designer. She had, you know, there were certain other kinds of embodiments that clearly marked her as someone who was not just dark, but also someone who was poor, someone who was working class, someone who all these other sorts of ideas that were not just coming through from her skin color, right? Because it was other markers that linked her to a certain social status. And that is, you know, the ways that color and class are linked, right? Because they could have had a panel where it was someone who was from the media industry who was darker skinned and was also a model or an actor, and that conversation would have looked different. And in this case, it was an intentional move, right? I mean, I wrote a whole thing to the network for no reason because I just needed to get it out. But I think, you know, that was to me so indicative of the ways that colorism is encoded and then decoded by people who interact with folks. And so it transcends skin color, right? It's about the meanings that are attached to just the body, right? That in which skin color is one part of it.
It's so prevalent within the East Asian culture that I mean, this is even my mother will start saying these terrible backwards things about other Asian countries that are like maybe closer to the equator. So there is a clear hierarchy between East Asians of like Japan, China, Korea being on a certain level, and like the Philippines, Vietnam, other countries being on a whole nother level based on largely skin color, but it denotes educational attainment. It denotes the country's like level of development even, and it's really wrapped up in how you look, but it's so insidious on, like you said, on so many other levels. And it automatically, even within like advancement within the Asian context, to be tied in a certain framework like that. Nuts.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Oh, speaking.
I realize we're already like 12 minutes left in the hour. And it wasn't in the question set, but it was in some of the discussions that Jordan and I had when we were thinking about this as a discussion topic. So we have all of this kind of going from something as slight as, you know, beauty all the way to economic empowerment to like downright violence against brown folks. But what is this obsession? If you type in fake tan fails, that there is a slew of white people that are struggling so hard to become darker. We now have a couple of examples of white women pretending to be Black women and getting by with it because of this weird definition around
Yeah,
colorism and
great
race.
example. It's just, yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could shed any light on that as a phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, with tanning, there have been, I think there was a recent book, I can't remember the name of it, that was published this year, and that looks at the meanings around skin color. And tanning is one of those things. I think it's like 1920s and 30s, I believe, is when it started to really become popular. And also what it signaled was this way, you know, once tanning was becoming popular, it signaled this heightened marketing of skin lightening products to communities of color, right, in the US. And so you have this sort of, you know, and with tanning, what's interesting, it's, yes, it's about being darker, but it's not also, right? It's not about being darker. You're not trying to be, you're trying to get a tinge, right? You're trying to get something that marks you in a certain way, but that will never affect you in the ways that Black and brown skin affects Black and brown people, right? And so that, you know, is sort of the tanning piece. The other piece, which, you know, it was in one of the questions, and I was thinking about it in preparation, but, you know, the immense appropriation of Black features, right? Black hair, and the example was, what was that professor's name? I don't even remember, but
He was in Washington, yeah.
Right. And, you know, it reminds me of this Bell Hooks essay that I turn to often when I'm thinking through these things, but it's called Eating the Other. And basically, I mean, it's a, you know, phenomenal essay because it gets at, you know, she writes something like, difference seduces, and this may not be the exact quote, this is what I remember. Difference seduces because mainstream sameness is a provocation that terrorizes, right? And it's such a sort of, like, it just hit me because it's true. There's something about this co-optation, this, you know, embodiment that allows you to actually claim a kind of commodified Blackness or brownness without taking on any of the other stuff, right? And you've actually turned it into a commodity that's become disembodied, and that doesn't challenge any of the systems that actually, you know, produce this kind of otherness that can be capitalized off of. So, you know, thinking about that question, you know, the most egregious example, I guess, would be the Kardashians, right? And kind of seeing the ways that they have built a, you know, an entire, I would say, like, economy around this, you know, this, which I say is a form of violence, right? This kind of stealing and building off of the labor and the traditions of Black folks. And so I think that, you know, is one really stark example. But it is true. I mean, we're seeing a lot of, you know, and it kind of gets diluted when you have conversations around cultural appropriation, because my students love talking about that stuff. But it's always important to make sure we're locating it to the historical moments that have allowed that kind of extraction to take place. So I wasn't trying to bring the Kardashians into the conversation, but
I figured
they are an egregious example.
It was just a matter of time.
Yeah.
So thank you for doing that succinctly. You also got me thinking about, you know, like you said, how this dynamic interacts with class. You know, because if you're talking about tanning or the desire or aversion to, you know, having a tan, you know, it's obviously different now than it was in, you know, feudal society or medieval times, where people wanted to be fair because that meant that they were noble and didn't have to work. And obviously, if you were outside, you might have darker skin, you know, because you're exposed to the sun. So it's now a sign of leisure. People get to go on vacation or wherever they get their tan from. But, you know, if they don't get too dark, they don't have to experience like what actual dark people would.
Right.
So,
And that's where the other characteristics come into play, right? You can be a very tanned, probably darker than, let's say, Meghan Princess, or I guess Duchess of
Mark,
Sussex or whatever, that you end up being darker than she is, but because you don't have the other cues of what we think is features of a certain race, that you don't have to take on some of the burdens of being the other in the mainstream culture. So it's quite insidious. Well, I think we're coming to a close at the top of the hour. Is there anything else you want to touch on that we didn't ask?
I think we covered a lot. I don't know if you have, I'm curious to know actually how you both came to organize and have this conversation around colorism, sort of what sparked that.
I think Jordan and I have brainstormed, we get on these long phone calls and talk about all that is wrong with the world. And we think about like, what is the idea of colorism as a discussion topic came up when the Kamala Harris was nominated. And it was one of those things that Jordan shared a lot of resources on, but I'm like, this is so relevant because Kamala Harris, again, another light-skinned, I guess,
Asian,
Black descent, right? And half South Asian. And, you know, there's this talk about like, she's not Black enough, or she's too Black. And there's all this discussion around this identity that is just totally made up, right? Like this is all a social construct. And so we came to that, just talking back and forth.
For me, I also have, I guess, a long-standing experience with colorism in dance and ballet. That's my background, outside of organizing work. And I was always hyper conscious of it because, automatically, if you go into the dance world, you have mandated, attire and tights that are flesh toned. But, what does that mean if they're all pink? And, I'm not. Shoes and things like that, and I think a lot of us until we were a certain age just thought, well, that's, supposed to be the color. But then you're like, no, it's supposed to, blend in and be, almost seamless with your skin. And it just doesn't work because there isn't a history of that being inclusive to dark skinned people. And so, there's just, environments like that where there is an element of, like you said, white supremacy and heteropatriarchy playing into what's perceived as acceptable or appealing. And that just extends to various parts of that, the performing arts. I also connected with dance and that, costume element, have experience in fashion. And like you said, Hareem, it's just fashion and beauty, continue to perpetuate colorism in various forms. So really, I wanted to delve deeper into that and, just talk about how overall it is a systemic issue.
Yeah, and it's also, interesting because I think those initial definitions of colorism where it's, prejudice based on skin tone within communities, right? And that even that language of within is interesting to me because I think, speaking to your ballet experience, it's, it's not just folks within communities of color that harbor this, right? White folks can also be colorist, right? Like white folks can also have, and I think any kind of approach to colorism, which relegates it to certain communities, I think could be served better by actually putting it in conversation. Like, so those employment, the studies coming out that correlate skin color with folks being able to get jobs or the ways folks are received. So like there was one study where I think it was lighter skinned individuals and Latinx individuals were seen by their employers as being more intelligent, right? And so there's studies like that that are done, and the employers in many cases are, white folks. And so the fact that they're harboring colorism, right, is a way to transcend the sort of like internal community conversation and actually kind of look at it, like you said, Jordan, you know, systemically, that these aren't just, you know, like it's not just self-hate, or it's not, you know, this has been sort of cultivated and enforced through many different means.
Absolutely.
Thank you. You've also mentioned a lot of really great resources in our conversation, and we might follow up with you after this so that we can post them to the group.
Absolutely. I have a list going, so I'll share that.
And then, do you mind sharing what the bell hooks book, the particular one that you were mentioning, was?
The one about the origins of like skin color.
Yeah, was that Eating the Other? Is that right?
That was the essay by Bell Hooks. The one, it's Nina Jablonski, and she wrote a book. She wrote 2 books on skin and skin color. I read Living Color is her second book. And she basically divided the book into 2 sections. One is on biology. So it speaks to your question that you had, which I cannot speak to, but sort of what, you know, why is it that skin has color? Like that sort of very biological question.
Why of it, yeah.
Yeah, and then the second part is it's called society. And then it gets into some of the cultural and social forces that shaped the meanings that get attached to skin color. So that's a book. There are a few other books. There's actually a podcast that was recently aired. It had, I think, 3 or 4 episodes through Glossy, and it's called Unfair. And in that podcast, they also share a lot of resources, and they carry out interviews with academics who've written about systemic colorism or historical, the history of colorism, either through the lens of cosmetic consumption or through like tanning, for example. And so I have a list. So you have, I think Lynn Thomas had a book that came out this year titled Beneath the Surface. And some activists to keep an eye out for. There is this one person I follow who is great and is become this vocal activist in India around colorism. And she's also a model. Her name is Seema Hari. And so she has, you know, some online presence, but also talks about colorism as systemic and in the ways it's affected her life. So there are more, and I'm happy to email and share them.
And would love to share that with the group. Well, thank you so much for taking time out in your busy academic schedule. I don't even know what school is like now with everything on Zoom.
Yeah, this is just me basically for 8 hours a day, just, you know, sit
well,
here.
I mean, this was an engrossing conversation, so I hope all of your students are just as engrossed and doing their best to go out and change the world after they take your class.
One can hope, but
yes. Thank you so much
for creating the space. It's been really nice to actually see you both and dialogue with you. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Hareem.
Thank you. We look forward to staying connected. Yes. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.